There are stories in the wild that begin like ordinary moments of survival, until something happens that makes both nature and mankind fall silent. On Arizona's rugged Zerella Ridge, a peaceful morning turned into a nightmare when a lioness fell into a deadly mud pit and slowly sank toward her final breath. But what no one could have imagined was that the first creature to hear her cry wasn't another lion, and not even a human. It was an old Mustang. And what that horse did next left everyone speechless. The first light of day slid gently over Zerella Ridge, painting the red rocks of Arizona in soft gold. Down in a narrow valley between the cliffs, the air was still cool and dry, carrying the faint scent of sage and dust. A lioness named Mara moved quietly through the scrub, her paws soundless on the sandy ground. At her sides, trying their best to copy every step, padded her two cubs, Scout and Ember. Scout, the older one, stayed close to her shoulder, his ears pricked forward, trying to be serious and brave. Ember, a little smaller and a little more restless, zigzagged back and forth, chasing shadows and dust motes that sparkled in the slanting light. The world was still waking up. A single hawk circled high above them, and the soft murmur of a distant creek slipped through the rocks like a memory. Mara paused beside a cluster of low bushes and lifted her head, drawing the air slowly into her lungs. Her whiskers trembled as she tasted the scents carried on the breeze. She lowered her head toward Scout and bumped him gently with her nose, urging him to do the same. He tried, sniffling too fast at first, then more slowly as he imitated her calm, steady breathing. Listen. If her thoughts could have been words, they would have been simple and patient. The wind will tell you what your eyes cannot see. Scout's little chest rose and fell as he inhaled. He caught the dry smell of rock, the faint sweetness of a patch of wildflowers somewhere upwind, the sharp, musky trace of a coyote that had passed in the night. His eyes widened with quiet wonder. Ember pushed her way in, always unwilling to be left out, and sniffed noisily, then sneezed when a bit of dust tickled her nose. She blinked up at Mara, embarrassed, and Mara gave her a slow blink in return. A mother's soft reassurance. It is all right, little one. They moved on, the three of them passing through long fingers of shade cast by towering stone. The rising sun turned the cliff faces into glowing walls of orange and red. Now and then, Mara would stop and tilt her head, letting the cubs stand beside her and simply listen. They heard crickets hidden in the grass, the far-off call of a raven, the gentle scrape of lizards wriggling under rocks. Life was everywhere, even in this harsh place. For a moment, the world felt perfectly balanced. Mara's muscles were loose and easy beneath her tawny coat. The cubs were healthy, their eyes bright, their steps sure. They did not yet know what it meant to be hungry for too many days, or to be hunted instead of hunting. To them, the valley was a big, sunlit playground, and their mother was unbreakable. As they climbed a gentle slope, the valley opened up ahead of them. Zerella Ridge rose on both sides like the ribs of some ancient animal, holding the sky in place. A soft gust of wind rolled through the rocks, and with it came a new sound. Faint at first, then sharper. A harsh, metallic cry that echoed between the cliffs. Ember stopped. Her ears flicked forward, her body suddenly still. The cry came again, raspy and strained, the sound of wings beating against air in short, frantic bursts. High on one of the ledges, just visible between two jagged rocks, a large bird struggled, one wing dragging at an unnatural angle. An eagle caught on something it could not escape. Scout stayed by Mara's side, uneasy. He did not like the sound. It scraped along his nerves and made the fur on his neck stand up. But Ember took a step forward, then another, drawn by a curiosity that was stronger than her fear. The birds' cries rose and fell, desperate, filling the narrow valley with a strange, harsh music. Mara watched, her eyes narrowing. She knew that sound. She had heard it before, when a creature was trapped, when pain had gone on too long. It was not a threat to her, not from that distance, but it was a disturbance, a broken thing in a morning that had been calm and clean. Her tail flicked once behind her. Ember glanced back at her mother, then toward the ledge, then back again. There was a faint, crumbling path along the side of the rocks that led in that direction, half hidden by brush and loose stone. To a cub, it looked like an invitation. The eagle shrieked again, flapping in a wild burst that rained dust and small pebbles down from the ledge. Ember flinched, then inched closer, heart pounding, eyes wide. The sound was frightening, but it was also impossible to ignore. Something in her small chest stirred, a strange, clumsy mix of fear and the urge to understand. "Stay close," Mara might have said if she had human words. Instead, she stepped forward and blocked Ember's path with her body. Scout leaned into her leg, relieved. Ember pressed her nose into Mara's shoulder for a brief second, then slid sideways, searching for another angle, another way up. The path along the rock face sloped gradually upward, leading toward a narrow cleft. From down below, it was hard to see where the ground ended and the drop began. Loose gravel shifted underfoot, and small stones clattered down the slope. Mara's eyes traced that path, measuring the risk by instinct alone. The wind shifted again, bringing with it a faint tang of something else. Old metal, dry and sour, buried beneath the dust. Somewhere up there, alongside the wounded bird, was a wrongness that did not belong to the land. A man-made smell in a place that should have been only rock and sky and bone. Mara's ears twitched. She did not understand what it was, only that it was there. The cubs did not smell it at all. They smelled their own excitement, their mother's tension, the bird's pain. To them, the world was still mostly simple. The sun climbed higher, warming the cliff walls. Shadows shrank and sharpened. The cry of the eagle rose one more time, hoarse and broken, echoing off every stone. Ember's paws danced in place, her little body trembling with the need to move. Scout pressed closer to Mara, feeling something in the air change, though he could not have said how. The calm that had wrapped the valley in softness just moments before began to thin, like mist burned away by heat. There was still no danger on the ground where they stood. The earth under Mara's paws felt solid enough. The breeze was still gentle on her face, but somewhere just ahead, just out of sight, the day was waiting to turn. Mara lowered her head and touched each cub with her nose, one after the other. Scout leaned into her with quiet trust. Ember pulled away almost immediately, her eyes flicking toward that hidden path along the rocks. Without another glance back, the little lioness turned and trotted toward it, drawn by the voice of the wounded sky. Mara watched her for one heartbeat, then another. In that brief pause, the whole world seemed to hold its breath. Then the lioness stepped after her daughter, leaving the open, safe valley behind and walking straight toward the narrow place where stone and fate were already beginning to crumble. The narrow path Ember followed clung to the side of the rock like a crack in old pottery, uneven and half crumbled by years of wind. Loose gravel rolled under her paws with every step. Scout stayed below with Mara, pacing restlessly, watching his sister climb with a mixture of awe and dread. Ember felt none of that. Her small heart thudded with a fierce curiosity as she moved toward the strange, broken cries echoing from above. Mara followed close behind, her body tense, her eyes never leaving Ember's tiny paws. She knew how quickly this kind of path could betray the weight of even a small animal. The earth in places was dry as old bone, in others slick with powdered stone that shifted like water. Every sound was sharper here, the scuff of paws, the rasp of rock sliding against itself, the harsh echo of the eagle struggling somewhere near the ridge. Ember reached a narrow bend in the path where the cliff rose sharply on her left and dropped out of sight to her right. She hesitated only a second, listening again to the sound of wings striking stone. She edged forward, her tail flicking nervously behind her. The ledge grew narrower, so narrow Mara had to flatten her body to keep her balance as she followed. The wrong smell returned, faint but bitter, prickling the inside of Mara's nose. Not the clean scent of wind through rock, not the musky trace of another predator. No, this was cold, metallic, tinged with rust, a smell that did not belong anywhere in a wild place. Mara paused and lowered her head, tasting the air again. The eagle cried out, a low scraping sound that trembled through the canyon walls. Scout, below them, whined softly. He wanted to climb up, to be with them, but the edge looked too unstable for his unsure feet. He paced along the bottom, eyes wide, ears pinned back. Mara gave a low chuff to him. Stay. It was all she could offer. Ahead, the path curved again and disappeared behind a jut of stone. Ember turned the corner first, her ears pricked forward, her steps too quick. Mara tried to call her back with a soft growl, but the wind swallowed the sound. Ember took 2 more eager steps, and then the ground under her paws dipped abruptly downward, as if the ridge itself had inhaled. Mara's heart lurched. She surged forward, reaching Ember just as the little cub scrambled back, startled by the sudden steepness. Ember regained her footing, but the shift sent a faint tremor through the thin strip of stone beneath them. Mara felt it pulse through her paws, a vibration too light for a cub to notice, but unmistakable to her. Something was hollow beneath this stretch of rock. She nudged Ember behind her, pressing the cub against the inner wall of the cliff. Ember obeyed, though her eyes stayed locked on Mara's face, sensing the change in her mother's body. Mara edged forward alone, testing the surface with slow, deliberate steps. Scout cried out from below. The cry echoed up the canyon, thin and worried. The eagle shrieked again, a desperate, ragged blast of sound. Mara lifted her head toward it. She could see the ledge now, a narrow shelf high above, where the bird hung half-trapped in a tangle of old wire lodged between boulders. The source of the metallic smell, a rusted trap left behind by someone long gone. A gust of wind swept through the canyon, carrying dust that stung the eyes. The rock beneath Mara shifted, just a whisper of motion, but enough. She instinctively stepped back, but Ember, worried for her, moved forward at the same instant. Their bodies brushed, just a soft contact, but the slight shift of weight was all the ledge needed. The stone gave way. It didn't crumble slowly or warn them with a groan. It fractured with a sharp, cracking pop, the sound of something old breaking clean apart. The whole ledge dropped beneath Mara like a collapsing lung. Ember was thrown backward into the wall of the cliff, tumbling onto a patch of firmer ground. But Mara fell. Her hind paws scraped desperately at the edge as she tried to push off, but the rock had already vanished under her. The world tilted, spun, roared in her ears. She plummeted straight down through a curtain of dust and shards of shattered stone, her body twisting in instinctive panic. Scout screamed, a raw, piercing cry that tore through the canyon. Mara's fall ended with a brutal, sickening plunge into something soft and cold, bubbles and dark. Water splashed around her, her legs thrashed, searching for solid ground, but found only thick, heavy mud. She sank nearly to her belly in the first second, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs. She lunged forward, trying to lift herself, but the mud clung to her with a grip like wet cement. Each movement dragged her deeper, the cold swallowing her strength in greedy pulls. Panic surged through her. She strained to rise again, but the mud closed around her legs, pulling tighter, sucking her down inch by inch. A sudden spike of pain shot through her shoulder. She twisted and saw the cause. A long shard of stone, broken off in the fall, had driven itself into her flesh. Dark blood seeped out, mixing with the mud in ugly swirls. Above her, Ember's small face appeared at the edge of the broken rock, eyes wide, mouth trembling. Scout stood beside her, frozen in horror. Their tiny cries echoed down, bouncing between the canyon walls in trembling waves. Mara tried to reassure them with a sound, any sound, but her throat tightened around the effort. Her voice came out as a rough, strangled rasp. The mud slurped, heavy and deep, inching up her sides. Scout tried to climb down the shattered slope of stone fragments, but the ground shifted beneath him. Ember threw herself across his path, pushing him back with all her tiny weight, her body shaking as she did. She didn't know why. She only felt instinctively that if Scout tried to reach Mara, they would lose him too. Mara watched them, her heart thudding wildly. She tried again to pull herself free, but the shard in her shoulder drove deeper. A sharp bolt of pain shot across her chest, and she gasped, her legs trembling with every sinking inch. The sun above them continued to rise, warming the cliffs. Dust drifted gently down into the pit where Mara struggled. The eagle, still trapped, cried out again, a fading echo of its earlier fury. Up on the ridge, her cubs pressed close to each other, their small bodies shaking as they stared down at the mother they could not reach. The narrow world that had felt safe only moments before now loomed with deadly silence. Mara's ears twitched as another wave of cold mud crept up her ribs. She tried to lift her head, but the pain in her shoulder made her vision blur. She blinked once, twice, tasting the metallic tang of her own blood mixed with the bitterness of mud. Somewhere deep inside her, the first thread of fear gave way to something heavier. The dawning knowledge that she might not climb out of this place alive. The cold mud tightened around Mara like a living thing, thick and heavy, dragging at her legs with a force she could feel deep in her bones. Every breath came harder than the last. She tried again to lift one paw, then the other, but each movement only made the mud surge higher along her ribs. The wound in her shoulder pulsed with a dull, throbbing ache, sending small jolts of pain down her side. The shard of stone lodged there felt like a burning brand, and every twitch only made it bite deeper. Above her, the broken ledge cast a narrow triangle of light into the pit. Dust drifted down in slow spirals, settling onto her coat, mixing with the mud until she looked less like a lioness and more like a fading shadow of herself. Scout and Ember peered over the jagged edge, their small bodies trembling. Their cries reached her in thin, wavering threads that tugged at her heart more sharply than the pain in her flesh. Scout paced so close to the edge that loose stones tumbled down around Mara, splashing into the mud beside her. Ember pressed against him, trying to push him back, her tiny paws braced in a desperate attempt to keep him from falling. Their movements were frantic and clumsy, driven by fear rather than reason. Scout's ears flattened against his skull, his cries rising higher, each one a plea for her to stand, to climb, to be the unshakable force he had always known. Mara tried to answer him, to give him even the faintest reassurance, but the sound that left her throat was strained and broken. It was little more than a breathy groan, swallowed almost instantly by the mud's slow, greedy slurp. Her lungs tightened, her vision blurred at the edges. She tried to blink the haze away, but it only grew thicker, like a fog settling inside her mind. The sunlight above shifted slightly as the morning moved on, and warmth crept down the canyon walls. But the warmth could not reach her. The mud held its cold like a secret, leaching the heat from her muscles with every passing moment. Her legs trembled, then stiffened, then trembled again. She fought for balance, lifting her head, trying to stay above the surface as the weight pulled at her relentlessly. A distant crackling sound echoed faintly from somewhere higher on the ridge, the rusted wire that trapped the eagle scraping against stone as the bird struggled. The eagle's cry came next, weaker now, more a whimper than a scream. Its voice, once sharp enough to startle Ember into danger, now seemed to fade in sympathy with Mara's own dwindling strength. The canyon felt smaller with every echo, as if closing in. Scout's cries turned to frantic yelps. He tried again to climb down the slope, his paws scrabbling for purchase. But the moment he moved, the gravel shifted under him. Ember lunged, biting the scruff of his neck, dragging him backward with the fierce determination only fear could give. Scout resisted, his tail lashing, but Ember held on, pulling until his hind legs found safer ground. Even then, she did not release him. Her jaw trembled visibly, but she did not let go. Mara watched them from below, her heart squeezing painfully. Her cubs, small, unsure, dependent, should not have been anywhere near such danger. And yet, here they were, alone and helpless, teetering above the place where she fought for breath. She tried again to push herself upward, but her injured shoulder gave a sharp, stabbing protest, forcing her back down. Her breath came in short gasps, each one a battle. A new sound reached her ears, one so soft she almost thought she imagined it. The faint trickle of water. The mud pool was fed by a hidden spring beneath the canyon, and now, as the sun warmed the upper rocks, the water began to seep more quickly into the pit. Mara felt the cold rise against her chest, inch by inch. The spring's flow was gentle but relentless. What had trapped her would soon drown her. She shifted her weight instinctively, trying to find a firmer patch beneath the surface. Her paw sank deeper instead. Panic flared through her, raw and electric. She thrashed once, a reflex she couldn't control, but the movement dragged her down another inch. She forced herself still. The mud quivered around her, sticky and unforgiving. Above, Ember released Scout at last and pressed herself to the rock, staring down at Mara with wide, terrified eyes. Her tiny body shook so violently it was visible even from the bottom of the pit. Scout leaned against her, his ears flat, his voice cracking as he cried out again and again, begging for her to rise, to climb, to fight. Mara lifted her head, straining to meet their eyes. She wanted to show them strength, to anchor them with her presence as she had every day since their birth. But her muscles trembled with the effort. She lifted her paw, a feeble attempt at reassurance, but the mud dragged it back under almost immediately. The canyon walls seemed to darken around her, though the sun was still shining above. The air grew thick, heavy, as if weighted by their fear. The sounds of the morning faded. The lizards, the ravens, the distant hum of wind. Even the eagle had grown silent. Only the soft drip of water and the muffled sobs of her cubs filled the space now. Mara's eyes drifted upward to the narrow ribbon of sky visible between the sheer rock faces. A thin cloud passed across the blue, its shape stretched and torn by the wind. For a moment she let her gaze rest there, letting the loneliness of the sky mirror the loneliness rising within her. The mud crept higher, her strength ebbed. Cold seeped deeper into her limbs. She blinked slowly, then again. Her breathing steadied, not because she felt calm, but because her body was giving in. A quiet acceptance settled over her, heavy and sorrowful. She tilted her head just enough to see Scout and Ember one more time. Their shapes blurred, their voices felt farther away, but she held their image close, burning it into the last bright corner of her mind. The world narrowed around her. The cold mud rose, and Mara, the lioness who had always walked the valley with strength and certainty, felt the first true whisper of a possibility she had never allowed herself to imagine, that she might not survive this day. Far across the lower flats of Zerella Ridge, where the desert opened into a wide stretch of pale grass and scattered mesquite, an old Mustang moved with slow, deliberate steps. Rust had lived through more seasons than most wild horses in this part of Arizona. His coat, once a deep chestnut, had faded along his flanks, and the white hairs spreading across his muzzle made him look as though the desert sun had bleached him one summer at a time. He paused beside a shallow patch of cracked earth where rainwater sometimes gathered after a storm. Today, it held only a thin sheen of moisture, hardly enough to drink. Still, he dipped his muzzle toward it, tasting the coolness before lifting his head again. His ears twitched. A faint breeze drifted through the valley. It carried more than heat and dust. It carried something raw, something that pressed against an old memory deep in his chest. A cry, thin, high, desperate, traveled across the wind. Rust lifted his head slowly, his ears pricked forward. The cry echoed again, bouncing off distant stone, trembling through the open space. It wasn't the shriek of the eagle he'd heard earlier that morning. That sound had traveled through the ridge for hours, fading only when exhaustion overtook the struggling bird. This sound was different, frantic, frayed, filled with a young creature's fear. Rust took a step forward, then another. His hooves pressed into the dry earth, each strike sending a faint vibration up his legs. He did not trot or gallop. He simply walked with a growing urgency, led by instinct more than reason. Once, years ago, he had cried out like that, a weaker, younger version of himself, trapped by a steel-jawed trap left near a cattle fence. The memory was blurry now, worn thin with time, but the feeling of fear had never quite left him, nor had the memory of the man who freed him. He followed the wind. It carried the scent of rock, dust, and something else, a sharp tang of blood, faint but unmistakable. The air around him shifted again, bringing with it another broken cry. This time it was fuller, louder, edged with panic. Rust quickened his pace. The land tilted upward into the base of the ridge. The sound grew sharper as he climbed a low rise covered in brittle grass. When he reached the top, he stopped, frozen by the sight below. Two lion cubs stood on the edge of a jagged break in the rock, their tiny bodies trembling. One, the smaller of the two, paced in frantic circles, pressing its face into the other as if begging for comfort it could not find. The older cub leaned dangerously over the edge of the broken ledge, its cries spilling into the canyon below. Rust's breath caught. He'd never been this close to lion cubs before, and every instinct in his body told him to stay away. But something in their voices, the rawness, the helplessness, tugged at him like the echo of his own long-ago suffering. He took a cautious step forward. Scout spotted him first. The cub whirled around, planting his feet and puffing himself up in a futile attempt to appear larger. His tail lashed, his tiny fangs showed. But his bravery melted the moment Ember pressed into his side again, trembling so hard her whole body shook. Rust stopped, head low, not in fear, but in calm acknowledgement. He made no sound. He simply stood there, breathing softly, letting the cub see that he meant no harm. Scout hesitated. His ears twitched. He backed up slightly, not out of fear, but because his instincts, still forming and uncertain, didn't know what to make of a creature who didn't behave like prey or predator. Rust took another slow step forward, and that's when he heard her. A low, muffled groan from deep inside the canyon, a sound full of pain. Another memory flickered in Rust's mind, the sharp snap of metal, the crush of a trap, the panic that had risen in his throat, and the gentle voice of the ranger who had come to save him. The memory wasn't clear, but it lived inside him like an ember that never went out. He walked closer to the cubs. Scout backed away, but did not flee. Ember stayed pressed against the rock, her eyes wide and wet. As Rust stepped near the edge, he peered down into the darkness of the broken pit. There she was, Mara, her body half submerged in cold mud, her head just above the surface. Blood streaked down her shoulder, staining the mud a dull reddish brown. Her breaths came in shallow heaves, each one weaker than the last. Her eyes were half open, glazed with shock and exhaustion. Rust exhaled sharply through his nose, a soft rumble of concern. The cubs looked between him and their mother, their cries rising again, full of helpless terror. Ember nudged Rust's leg timidly, almost as if pleading with him to do something, anything. The old Mustang did not understand them the way another lion would, but he understood fear. He understood suffering, and he understood the way a creature's cry changed when it knew the end was near. Rust looked toward the horizon. A faint glimmer of sunlight flashed off a distant piece of metal, the roof of the ranger station tucked behind the next rise. He knew that place. He knew the smell of the man who worked there, a smell tied to his most fragile memory of survival. He lifted his head higher, ears forward, heart pounding with a strange mix of dread and determination. Then he turned away from the cubs. Scout cried out in confusion. Ember backed up, thinking he was abandoning them. But Rust didn't slow. He broke into a trot, his hooves striking the ground with more force than they had in years. Then he galloped, an old horse, but one with purpose burning through every muscle, still willing to answer. Dust rose behind him as he sped across the open ground, carrying with him the desperate message the cubs could not deliver. Behind him, Scout and Ember huddled together at the broken edge of the pit, their cries thin and shaking. Below them, Mara's head sagged, her breath growing shallow, her body sinking farther into the mud. Above them, Rust ran toward the only creatures who might understand the meaning of a cry too broken for the desert to ignore. The ranger station sat low against the land, as if it had learned long ago not to stand too tall in a place where wind and time knocked everything down eventually. The paint on the siding was sun-faded, the flag on the short pole out front hung heavy, barely stirring in the late morning heat. Inside, the air conditioner hummed in a tired rhythm, doing its best to push back the desert. Ranger Thomas Caldwell sat at his worn metal desk, a mug of black coffee cooling at his elbow, paperwork spread in front of him in slow, patient piles. He was a big man, gone a little soft with age, his hair more gray than not, his skin lined from years of staring into bright horizons. His knees ached when he stood too long, and his left shoulder still twitched on cold nights from an old fireline injury. But his eyes were clear, steady, and they had seen enough of the world to know that quiet never lasted as long as you hoped it would. On the wall behind him hung a framed photograph of a much younger Caldwell standing beside a pack of smoke jumpers, all soot-streaked and grinning, flames rising in the distant background. Below it, another picture, this one of a small Mustang with a bloody leg, a rusted trap lying open beside him. Caldwell's own hand was in that shot, resting gently on the horse's neck. He sighed and pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose, trying to focus on the forms in front of him. Grazing permits, trail reports. A note from the county about an old fence line that needed checking. He'd rather be out there than in here, but the job came with both. Outside, the wind shifted. He didn't hear it at first, just felt the faint change in the quality of light that came through the blinds, a thicker, hazier cast. Somewhere out there, dust was starting to lift. It was that time of day. He was reaching for his coffee when the radio on the desk crackled to life, spitting static and half-formed words from a neighboring unit. Nothing urgent. He started to tune it in when a different sound cut through, distant at first, then sharper. Hoofbeats. Fast. Caldwell frowned and turned in his chair, squinting through the blinds toward the dirt road that wound in from the flats. Dust was rising in a narrow line, and at the front of it he set a familiar shape pounding toward the station. "Now, what in the world?" he murmured, pushing his chair back. He stepped out onto the small concrete porch, the heat rolling up off it like breath. The old Mustang barreled closer, chest heaving, mane ragged from the wind. It was Rust. Caldwell knew that gait, knew that face, knew the way the horse's ears were locked forward, not in fear, not in anger, but in determination. Rust didn't slow until he was almost at the porch. He skidded to a stop, dust spraying around his legs, and tossed his head, snorting hard. His sides heaved, ribs rising and falling under sun-faded hair. Caldwell stepped down off the porch, one hand, instinctively held out, palm open. "Easy, old man," he said quietly. "Easy now. What's got you so riled up?" Rust danced in place, hooves striking the packed earth. Caldwell smelled it then, under the sharp scent of sweat and dust, something else. A faint, rusty tang. He moved closer and saw smear marks along Rust's shoulder and back. Not his own blood. Smaller prints. Paw prints. "Lions," Caldwell breathed, his jaw tightening. The memories lined up in his mind without invitation. The trap. The blood. The way Rust had once collapsed against him, shaking and wild-eyed, as he'd worked the steel jaws loose. Animals didn't forget pain, and they didn't forget the ones who helped remove it. Rust snorted again and turned his head sharply toward the ridge. It wasn't a casual glance. It was a pointed, urgent gesture. Caldwell followed his gaze, and the hair on the back of his neck stood up. He heard the station door click open behind him. "Tom?" a young woman's voice called. "Everything okay?" Ranger Maya stepped out, squinting into the light. She was in her late 20s, her dark hair pulled back in a loose braid, sleeves rolled up, radio clipped at her shoulder. She'd only been at Zerella Ridge for a couple of years, but she'd already seen her share of emergencies. She saw Rust, then the look on Caldwell's face, and her posture straightened. "What's going on?" she asked. Caldwell didn't answer right away. He ran his hand gently along Rust's neck, feeling the tremble beneath the skin. "Take a look at his back," he said quietly. Maya stepped closer, careful, not wanting to spook the Mustang. She saw the smeared dust and faint prints. Her brows knotted. "Are those cub tracks?" she asked. "Looks like it," Caldwell said, "and they're fresh." A small gust of wind kicked up, swirling dust around their boots. Out over the flats, the sky had taken on a faint, yellowish cast. It wasn't a full-blown storm yet, but the kind of creeping haze that could turn nasty if the day leaned that way. Maya shaded her eyes, looking out toward the ridge. "You think he came from the canyon?" "I think he came from somewhere he didn't want to be," Caldwell replied. "And he came here on purpose." Rust stamped a hoof and jerked his head again toward the distant rocks, eyes wide and shining. Caldwell saw something in those eyes he hadn't seen since the day he freed him. A plea. He exhaled slowly. "Go start the truck," he told Maya. "We're heading out." She hesitated, glancing at the forms scattered on his desk through the open door. "What should I log it as? Routine check? Disturbance?" Caldwell looked back toward the ridge, listening. For a moment, there was nothing but wind and the faint rustle of dry grass. Then, carried on that wind, just barely, came a sound he didn't need a radio to hear, a thin, distant cry that didn't belong to any human. It raised the old familiar, knot in his chest. "Log it as a response," he said quietly. "Somebody out there is in trouble." Maya nodded and hurried inside. Caldwell stayed with Rust, resting his hand on the horse's neck. "You remembered the way back," he murmured to him. "All this time you remembered." Rust blew out a hard breath, then tossed his head again toward the ridge, impatient. Within minutes, the truck's engine rumbled to life. Maya swung it around in front of the station while Caldwell grabbed the emergency kit, ropes, harness, first aid gear, and the tranquilizer rifle, just in case. He tossed it all into the back, then paused at the rack and grabbed an extra coil of climbing rope and a small folding ladder. The sky had darkened another shade by then, dust rising in low sheets across the open ground. "You see that?" Maya asked, looking toward the horizon. "Wind's picking up. We might get slammed out there." Caldwell shut the tailgate with a firm thud. "We'll be faster than the storm if we move now." "And if we're not?" she asked. He studied her for a second, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepening. She wasn't being flippant. She was doing what he'd trained her to do, assess risk, think ahead. He respected that, but there were some days when the math changed. "If someone's crying out there," he said, his voice low but steady, "we don't wait. We go." That was it. No speech, no lecture, just the simple rule he'd lived by longer than she'd been alive. Maya held his gaze for a beat, then nodded. "All right," she said, "then let's go." Caldwell climbed into the driver's seat, his knees complaining, as they always did, and turned the truck toward the ridge. Before he could pull out, Rust trotted ahead of them, moving back onto the faint trail that cut through the scrub. "He's leading us," Maya said softly, watching through the windshield. "Then we'll follow," Caldwell answered, and eased the truck into gear. They rolled out across the flats, the old Mustang running just far enough ahead to show the way, his mane whipping in the rising wind. Behind them, the little station sat quiet once more, and the papers on Caldwell's desk fluttered in the draft like tired birds that had decided to rest a while longer. Ahead of them, Zerella Ridge loomed, its broken teeth of rock cutting into a sky that was starting to turn the color of old brass. Somewhere within those canyons, a lioness was sinking, and two cubs were crying into the wind. Caldwell tightened his grip on the steering wheel, feeling the old familiar mix of dread and purpose settle into his bones. He had heard the call. Now he was on his way. The road to Zerella Ridge grew rough long before Caldwell and Maya reached the canyon. The wind had picked up, pushing low waves of dust across the flats, turning the landscape into shifting sheets of pale brown. The truck's tires crunched over loose stone, and every few seconds, Maya reached up to wipe grit from the inside of the windshield with her sleeve, even though the windows were rolled tight. Rust ran ahead of them with a determination that didn't match his age, his hooves kicking dust into the air as if he were carving a line directly toward the danger. Caldwell kept the truck steady, his jaw tight. Every instinct in his body told him this was worse than he wanted to believe. Animals didn't run miles in the rising heat unless something was terribly wrong. And not just wrong, urgent. He had seen that kind of panic before. In horses, in deer, even in a mountain lion that once staggered into a campsite with a porcupine quill buried deep in its throat. There was a tone to distress, a rhythm to fear. Rust was running like he heard both. "Tom," Maya said quietly, her eyes following the Mustang. "Whatever's out there, it's got him scared." Caldwell nodded once. That was exactly what worried him. When they reached the base of the ridge, Rust slowed, then stopped outright. He turned toward the two rangers and stamped his hoof once, sharply. Caldwell braked and killed the engine. The sudden silence hit them like a weight, broken only by the rising wind and the soft clatter of small stones shifting somewhere in the canyon above. "Grab the gear," Caldwell said, already climbing out. Maya hurried to the back of the truck and lifted the tailgate. The emergency kit was heavy, packed with everything they might need: climbing ropes, harnesses, a pulley, first aid supplies, small saws, a compact pry bar, and the tranquilizer rifle with a half-dozen darts. Caldwell grabbed the ladder and a pair of gloves while Maya slung the rope coils over her shoulder. Rust stepped closer to Caldwell, nudging him once in the chest with a surprising intensity. Caldwell placed a steadying hand on the old Mustang's cheek. "Show us," he murmured. Rust turned and trotted up the narrow incline that led deeper into the canyon. The trail twisted sharply between the rocks, and the sound of wind bouncing off the cliffs grew louder with every step. They followed him on foot now, boots crunching over gravel, rope ends swaying at their sides. After several minutes of climbing, they reached a point where the canyon narrowed into a tight throat of rock. Rust stopped here and looked down. Caldwell stepped forward. The sight that greeted him turned his stomach to stone. The pit below wasn't wide, but it was deep, a jagged cavity where the ledge had broken away. And at the bottom, just visible in the muted light, was Mara. Her body sagged in the thick mud, her chest barely above the surface. Her head hung low, her breath shallow and unsteady. Blood seeped down her shoulder, staining the mud a dark rusty color. Her legs shifted weakly now and then, but each movement looked slower, heavier, as if the mud were claiming 1 inch of her life at a time. And above her, pressed together at the broken rim, were Scout and Ember. Their little bodies trembled violently. Ember let out a whimper so soft it barely carried, and Scout answered with a cry that cracked in the middle, raw and terrified. They were too close to the edge, too desperate to understand danger. If one of them slipped, Caldwell knew they'd fall right in after her. Maya exhaled sharply. "Oh, God, she's stuck in a sink pit." Caldwell's voice dropped. "She's been in there too long." The mud wasn't the loose kind that bubbled or churned. It was thick, cold, packed with sediment, the kind that clung around the legs like iron bands and pulled deeper with every movement. He'd seen animals drown in far less. "Tom," Maya whispered as she knelt beside the edge, "that wound on her shoulder, she must have hit a stone on the way down." Caldwell scanned the scene with practiced eyes. The broken ledge, the shifting gravel, the crumbling slope. This wasn't just risky. It was lethal. "All right," he said, steadying himself. "Here's what we're going to do. Maya, anchor the rope around that outcrop. Test the load." She nodded, hands already moving. Caldwell grabbed the climbing harness and fastened it around his torso, cinching the straps tight. His shoulder ached, but he ignored it. He'd climbed in worse condition. He slipped on his gloves, then crouched beside the edge, peering down at Mara again. Her eyes fluttered open, but did not fully focus. She was drifting between pain, exhaustion, and the cold grip of the mud. Rust moved behind Caldwell and Maya, pacing restlessly. Every time Scout cried, Rust's ears shot up. Every time Ember whimpered, his hooves pawed the ground. It was as if he could feel the urgency vibrating in the air. Maya finished securing the rope and gave it a hard tug. "Anchored, you sure you want to go down there first?" "She doesn't have time for second guesses," Caldwell said. He looped the rope through his harness and gave it another tug. He turned to Rust, who watched him with wide, anxious eyes. "You did good," Caldwell murmured. "Now let us do the rest." He stepped backward over the edge and began the descent. The rock face was uneven, crumbling in places, slick in others. Dust rained down every time he shifted his weight. Maya kept the rope taut from above, feeding it through her hands just fast enough to let him lower himself in controlled drops. The canyon swallowed him in shadow as he descended, the air cooling noticeably the closer he came to the mud pit. Scout and Ember huddled together at the rim, peering down as he approached. Their cries grew louder, frantic, but they didn't run. They just watched, wide-eyed, as the human drew closer to their mother. Mara struggled to lift her head when she heard the scraping of Caldwell's boots against the rock wall. She blinked weakly and let out a low groan, fear, confusion, and pain tangled into one fragile sound. Caldwell spoke in the calm, low voice he used for frightened animals. "Easy now. Easy. We're here to help you." As his boots touched the last stretch of rock, the vibration caused the mud around Mara to ripple. The ripples tugged her downward another inch. Her breath sputtered. Caldwell hissed a quiet curse under his breath. He knelt low, extending one gloved hand toward her, careful not to touch the wound. Her skin twitched under his shadow. "Maya," he called up softly, "get the tranquilizer ready. If she panics, she'll sink." Maya was already preparing it, her hands steady despite the rising wind. Caldwell scanned the mud pit again. There was no firm ground in reach, no solid purchase. He would have to go closer, dangerously close. He tightened the rope grip around his waist. "All right," he murmured to Mara, "stay with me now." But as he stepped toward her, the mud shifted. A deep, dragging slurp echoed through the canyon. Mara's body dropped another 2 inches. She let out a broken cry, a sound that stabbed through the silence. Scout and Ember wailed in unison. Maya's voice echoed from above. "Tom, the wind's picking up. Stones are starting to move up here." He could hear it, the low rumble of loose gravel dislodging from the cliffs. Every second counted now. He reached for the tranquilizer rifle dangling from his harness, but just as he lifted it, the rope around his waist jerked unexpectedly. A rock had come loose above and knocked Maya off balance for a moment. Caldwell dropped to one knee to steady himself, and in that instant, the tranquilizer dart slipped from his glove. Time slowed. The dart fell through the air, end over end, and hit the mud with a soft plop before sinking out of sight. Caldwell's heart dropped with it. Mara's eyes fluttered closed, her body sinking another inch. Maya gasped from above. Rust let out a sharp, desperate cry. And Caldwell, feeling the mud tremble beneath him, knew with chilling certainty. He had just lost the safest chance to keep her still. Now he would have to save her without it. For a long, terrible heartbeat, no one moved. The tranquilizer dart vanished beneath the thick mud as if the earth had swallowed it whole. Caldwell stared at the spot where it had disappeared, feeling his stomach twist with cold dread. Without the dart, the Lioness could panic, and if she panicked, even for a moment, she would sink beyond his reach. Above him, Maya pressed herself against the unstable rim, gripping the rope with both hands. "Tom, tell me what you need," she shouted, her voice tight with fear. Pebbles skittered around her boots, rattling over the edge and dropping into the pit below. Scout and Ember cried out in trembling, broken voices. The wind carried their cries in small shivers down into the canyon, tugging at Caldwell's heart like a hook. Mara's head sagged forward, her muzzle barely above the mud. Every breath she took came out in a wet, rattling gasp. There was no time, no margin for error, no backup plan. "All right," Caldwell whispered to himself, feeling the familiar push of adrenaline straighten his spine. "We're doing this the hard way." He braced his boots against a narrow lip of rock that jutted out beside the pit. It was barely wide enough to stand on, but it was all he had. The mud was close, too close. One misstep, and he'd be sinking alongside Mara. Maya saw him adjusting the rope and understood instantly. "Tom," she called down, "don't you dare step into that mud. You'll never get out." He didn't answer. He leaned forward, stretching as far as he could, gripping the rope with one hand and reaching toward Mara with the other. The mud quivered as he shifted his weight. A soft sucking sound rose from beneath, like something alive moving under the surface. "Mara," he murmured, "you stay with me. I need you to lift your head." Her eyes flickered, dull and unfocused, but she tried. Her muscles quivered violently from the effort. The shard of stone lodged in her shoulder shifted again, sending a tremor of pain through her. She whimpered, a heartbreaking sound that hit Caldwell like a physical blow. He reached farther, trying to loop a smaller rescue strap around her chest, but the angle was wrong. The mud was too deep. The wound made her flinch away from pressure. Maya saw his struggle and searched the ground beside her. "Tom, I can lower another line. Give me 1 second." A sharp, crackling sound cut her off. A slab of loose rock above her shifted, then tumbled down the canyon wall, smashing against the slope just feet from Caldwell. Dust exploded into the air, choking and thick. "Forget it," Caldwell barked up at her through the dust. "We don't have seconds." Mara slipped another inch. Caldwell lurched forward instinctively, one hand diving into the mud just enough to keep her muzzle above the surface. The mud was freezing. It clung to his glove, sucked at his wrist like a creature desperate to pull him in as well. He gritted his teeth. "Oh, no, you don't. You're not taking her." The canyon trembled again. Scout and Ember backed away from the edge, crying frantically, their little bodies pressed together in fear. And then, Rust screamed. Not a frightened sound, but a piercing, urgent call that rang off the canyon walls like an alarm. Caldwell jerked his head up. The Mustang stood at the top of the slope, muscles trembling, ears pinned forward. His eyes were locked on Caldwell, on the mud, on Mara. He understood. Before Caldwell could process what was happening, Rust moved. He stepped closer to the edge, far too close for a horse his size. His hooves scraped against the brittle stone, sending small cascades of gravel downward. Maya gasped and tried to wave him back, but Rust didn't look at her. He only watched Caldwell, breathing hard through his nose. Then he did something Caldwell would never forget for the rest of his life. The old Mustang turned, sideways, presenting his left flank to Maya. He offered himself, positioning his body exactly where a counterweight was needed. Maya's voice caught. "Tom, he's waiting for the rope." Caldwell blinked through the dust, stunned for a fraction of a second. Then instinct roared back into him. "Maya!" he shouted. "Hook the secondary line to Rust's harness, now!" Maya scrambled, pulling one of the spare lines from the gear bag. Her hands shook as she looped the rope around Rust's torso, fastening it just behind his front legs. Rust didn't flinch. He didn't move. He stood stone still, his breath coming in slow, heavy bursts, as if he knew exactly what this meant. "Maya, anchor and tighten, fast," Caldwell ordered. She clipped the rope to her belay device and threw her weight backward, digging her boots into the rock. Rust stepped forward against the pull, creating natural tension in the line. Caldwell felt the rope around his waist tighten. Steady, reliable, no longer at the mercy of shifting rock. "Good boy," Caldwell whispered, not sure if Rust could hear him. "Good boy. Hold steady." The rope creaked under the strain. Caldwell reached again, deeper this time. The mud crawled halfway up his forearm as he looped the rescue strap beneath Mara's chest, careful to avoid the wound. The mud fought him, sucking and pulling, but the tension from Rust gave him the leverage he needed. Come on, Al," he grunted through clenched teeth. At last the strap slid into place. "Maya, pull," Caldwell yelled. Maya leaned her weight into the line, pulling with every ounce of strength she had. Rust stepped backward, muscles flexing, hooves digging grooves into the rocky ground as he pulled along with her. Whoosh. The line tightened. Caldwell pushed upward from below, guiding Mara's body inch by inch. The mud resisted at first, clinging greedily. Then, with a wet, wrenching sound, Mara's torso broke free from the suction. Her head lifted, Her body rose. Scout and Ember screamed with relief. "Keep going," Caldwell urged, voice hoarse. Rust dug in harder. Maya leaned back until her legs shook. Together, human and horse, they pulled the lioness upward, out of the pit that had nearly claimed her. Her back leg slipped once, but Caldwell shoved upward, straining every muscle in his aging body. Up, up! And finally, Mara's body cleared the rim of the pit, collapsing onto the rocky ground in a trembling heap. She gasped for breath, mud sliding off her sides in thick sheets. Caldwell slumped against the wall, chest heaving, his arm covered in freezing sludge. Maya fell to her knees, tears streaming, her hand still gripping the rope. Scout and Ember rushed to their mother, pressing their faces into her neck, mewling softly. But the only creature who didn't move was Rust. He stood perfectly still, the rope still tight around his body, sides heaving, sweat darkening his coat. His legs trembled, his breathing ragged, but his eyes stayed fixed on Mara. Caldwell looked up at him, disbelief and awe mingling. "Son," he whispered, barely able to speak, "you just saved her life." For a moment the canyon held its breath. A horse, a lioness, a man. Bound together by a moment no one could have imagined, a moment that would leave them all forever changed. For several long seconds, no one made a sound. The canyon, once trembling with panic and falling stones, now lay wrapped in a stunned, reverent quiet. Mara lay stretched on the rocky ground, her sides rising and falling in shallow waves. Mud clung to her fur in heavy mats, and blood from her wounded shoulder mixed with the gray sludge, streaking her coat in dark lines. But she was breathing, alive, and in that moment, that alone felt like a miracle pulled out of the desert's harsh grip. Scout and Ember pressed against her, their small bodies trembling as they nosed at her face and neck. Ember let out a series of soft, desperate whimpers while Scout kept licking her cheek, urging her to stay awake. Their tails flicked wildly, brushing against her shoulder, trying to stir her back to the world. Mara responded only with faint twitches, her breaths uneven, but steady enough to make hope finally feel real. Maya knelt beside the lioness, her hands shaking as she reached for her medical kit. "Tom," she said, her voice hushed, "her pulse is weak, but it's there. We can keep her stable." Caldwell nodded, trying to gather himself. His gloves were caked in mud up to his elbows, his muscles burned from the strain of holding Mara above the sinking pit, and his knees felt like they might buckle on him. But he stared at the lioness in awe, hardly believing they had pulled her out in time. And then his gaze lifted. Rust stood at the canyon wall, exactly where he had been during the rescue, the rope still wrapped around him. His legs trembled violently now, his breath coming in ragged bursts. Foam flecked the corners of his mouth. But his eyes, they were fixed on Mara, wide and bright, as if he refused to look away until he was certain she was safe. Caldwell moved toward him, unhooking the rope with gentle hands. "Easy, big fella," he murmured. "You did your part, more than anyone could have asked for." Rust shifted his weight, swaying slightly. Caldwell placed a steadying hand against the Mustang's neck, feeling the tremor running beneath the tired muscles. The old horse let out a deep exhale that shuddered through his whole body, then lowered his head, almost touching Caldwell's shoulder, as if leaning into him for a moment of rest. Maya glanced up, her eyes softening. "I've never seen anything like that," she whispered. "I don't think I ever will again." Caldwell gave a low chuckle that cracked in the middle. "Neither will I." He turned back to Mara, checking her wound. The shard embedded in her shoulder would need careful removal. Maya soaked a cloth from her canteen and began washing the mud away, revealing torn flesh beneath. Mara flinched but didn't lift her head. Scout and Ember pressed closer, watching the humans with wide, pleading eyes. "You two did good too," Caldwell said softly to the cubs, his voice gentler than Maya had ever heard it. "You stayed with her. You kept calling. You didn't give up." The cubs didn't understand his words, but they felt the tone. Scout blinked up at him with a mixture of fear and trust, while Ember leaned against Mara's chin, nuzzling into the fur that still carried her mother's scent beneath all the mud. Caldwell motioned for Maya to bring the emergency blanket. They draped it over Mara to keep her warm from the cold mud still clinging to her. The wind swept gently through the canyon again, no longer sharp and unsettling, but soft, carrying a faint scent of rain from somewhere far beyond the ridge. After several minutes, Mara stirred. Her ear twitched. Her paw flexed weakly. Her breathing deepened, gaining a fragile rhythm. Then, slowly, with effort heavy in every movement, she lifted her head. Scout jumped first, letting out a small chirp of pure relief. Ember squeaked beside him. Mara blinked at them, her eyes still hazy but alive. Then she turned her head, barely, just enough to see Caldwell and Maya kneeling near her. But it wasn't them she looked at first. It was Rust. The Mustang stood a few yards away, exhausted, but watching her with a steady gaze. A breeze caught his mane and lifted it slightly, revealing the long scar beneath. An old wound from a trap that had once caught him and nearly ended him. The memory of his pain, of his rescue, seemed alive in his eyes. Mara stared at him for several breaths, her pupils widening. Something ancient passed between them, an understanding beyond language, beyond instinct. The desert had no space for sentiment. But here, in this canyon, for a heartbeat in time, 3 species shared the same fragile thread of life. Mara lowered her head in a slow, deliberate motion, a gesture of acknowledgement, of gratitude. Rust answered by lowering his own head. Caldwell swallowed against the tightness in his throat. "Well," he said softly, "I'll be damned." Maya wiped her face with the back of her wrist, leaving a streak of mud. They understand each other. I swear they do. Caldwell stood with a groan, joints popping. "We should give them space," he said. "Let her gather her strength. The cubs will keep her warm." They stepped back, watching in silence. Mara nudged each cub gently, reassuring them. Her paw slid across the ground as she shifted her weight, testing the strength in her limbs. Maya reached for the first aid kit again, but Caldwell touched her shoulder. "No," he murmured. "She can handle the rest. We've done all we can without causing her more fear." So they waited. The sky began its afternoon shift, trading bright white for a warmer glow. The wind settled. Scout curled against Mara's chest, Ember tucked under her chin. After a time, Mara slowly rose to her feet. She shook off a layer of mud that splattered against the rocks, then winced as her shoulder protested. But she stayed upright. The cubs circled her ankles, tails flicking in nervous excitement. Rust watched her stand, his ears pricking forward, a soft rumble vibrating in his chest. Mara looked at him one last time. Then, with a quiet grunt to her cubs, she began moving toward the canyon's exit. Her steps were unsteady but determined. She didn't rush. She didn't hide. She moved like a mother who had one chance left. And was taking it. Scout and Ember followed close, looking back only once before disappearing around the bend. Caldwell let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "She'll make it," he said with quiet certainty. Maya nodded. "And those cubs? They'll never forget what happened today." Rust shifted, turning his head toward Caldwell again. The old Mustang's eyes were calmer now, his breathing steadier. Caldwell stepped to him and laid a hand on his cheek, gently stroking the weathered fur. "You remembered kindness," Caldwell whispered, "and you gave it back." Rust closed his eyes, leaning into the touch. The moment held, soft, warm, improbable. 3 worlds connected not by survival, but by mercy. When Caldwell and Maya finally headed back toward the truck, Rust followed for a few steps, then stopped and turned back toward the canyon, ears flicking toward the path where the Lioness had disappeared. Maya glanced over at the Mustang. "Think he'll check on them again?" Caldwell smiled faintly. "I think he already did his part. And sometimes," he added, looking out over the golden stretch of Zerella Ridge, "that's enough." They climbed into the truck, the engine rumbling to life. As they drove away, Rust stood alone for a while, the wind tugging gently at his mane. Then he turned, slow and steady, and walked back into the desert, quiet as a ghost, strong as an old memory. Behind him, the canyon lay silent again, holding the echo of a miracle that only the desert and those who witnessed it would ever understand. If this story touched your heart even a little, would you drop a simple 1 in the comments? Just a single number. But it lets me know you're right here with us. And if you'd like to hear more gentle, moving stories like this, go ahead and subscribe so you won't miss the next journey we share together. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'll see you in the next story.